We had been huddled in the car, holding tightly onto one another as we tried to cling our thoughts of safety. David shattered all of that. A sense of cataclysmic doom that had settled over us as we just stared at a sopping wet boy. I felt as though the ground had been pulled out from under me, as though the world were no longer real or solid. I felt wronged. I felt destroyed, and at the utmost, I felt violated. It was an odd sensation, but one well-deserved, I thought. We had found a haven, a place of safety, a home in the forest where we thought the monster that had systematically demolished our lives just couldn't reach us. And yet, here he was, standing just inches away from my window, hand on the cracked glass, empty sockets just staring out at us. A scream so loud that I felt myself vibrate with it slice through the silence. I still don't know who it belonged to. More panicked voices joined in before my father just sped away from the mouth of the forest and headed toward town. I remember that drive being the most frightening of all my life. Not just because David was somewhere behind us or because I thought he might follow us, but because of the erratic way that the station wagon zigged and zagged on the empty country road. I couldn't think of anything other than the question of what might have happened to our souls if we were to die in that moment. Would David capture them? Hide them in some den where we'd be at his mercy for the rest of eternity? Or would our Heavenly Father search for us if that did happen? I tried not to think about it. My father did 80 the whole way there, never slowing down until we were on Maple Road. It was a familiar stretch of pavement adjacent to our church, dotted with small middle-class homes, armed with manicured lawns and flawless gardens. The tires squealed, staining the cement with black rubber, and as we came to a screeching halt, my father's eyes were wide and frantic as he turned around, and he just stared at us. "Stay right here," he commanded, before he jumped out of the car and ran up the cement steps to the small blue home that we were parked in front of. Confusion swept over me. Aside from our church that peeked over the top of the trees, I didn't recognize a thing. "Where are we?" I asked, looking at the faces of my family members. Joey was still wailing, snot was running down his face, his cheeks and his forehead had just turned bright red, and Mom was trying to calm him down, but nothing was working. "Father Brown's house," Jack answered from the back. His voice was hoarse and basically defeated. I glanced back at him curiously. Father Brown had taught at our church. We went there every week, and Mom had gone to church group twice a week. But I wanted to know why we had chosen to come to Father Brown's house. Despite the fact that he was our priest, we never saw him outside of church. He wasn't like any of Dad's friends who came by on the weekend to play cards. He was practically a stranger. But another question was prodding at my small mind, one that I just couldn't possibly ignore. "How do you know?" I asked, as I watched my father ring the doorbell time and time again. "We went to his house for dinner once, when you were really, really little. It was just before Joey was born, so you were too little to remember," Jack explained, as he leaned against the seat. His head was resting on the soft cushion, and he looked exhausted. Great bags perched just below his eyes, and the color had gone away from his cheeks, but his eyes were open, seemingly without any difficulty. I had my doubts that he would ever sleep again. The door swung open, pulling my attention from my brother and back to my dad. Out stepped a very disheveled-looking Father Brown. The two men spoke to one another, but even in the silence of the car, I couldn't hear what was being said. It seemed like forever before my father turned around and waved us toward himself. Father Brown's eyes settled on each of us separately as we walked up the sidewalk. Pain washed over his features, and he made a small noise of pity. "Come on in, guys. James, Johnny, I don't have any clothes that will fit you, but you can wear one of my t-shirts for the night, and we'll see about getting you some of your clothes." Walking into the house made me feel light. There was a certain peace, a calm sort of serenity that settled over the home. It was a welcome change from the thick, heavy feeling of our own home, and Father Brown had allowed us to shower. He even fed us, and he gave us new clothes and washed those that were soiled with vomit and urine. We were sent to bed at midnight. I didn't think it was possible that I would even sleep that night, but I was proven wrong when In mere minutes, I sank into sweet oblivion while curled up in Jack's arms, my face pressed into his chest, and for the first time in weeks, I actually felt safe. The sun was just touching the horizon when I woke up. The green numbers on the clock across the room proclaimed that it was just after 5 a.m. My throat was on fire, and I hadn't realized until just then that I hadn't drank any water at all that day, and I was beginning to feel the repercussions. I laid entirely still as I toyed with the idea of getting up. I was warm and comfortable, and wearing the only t-shirt that Father Brown had given me. While massive and fitting more like a dress, it still meant that I was gonna be cold the minute that I stood up. I sucked in a deep breath, deciding it was best to just stand up and do it. If I didn't get something to drink, I'd never be able to go back to sleep. Just as I began to lift Jack's arm up off of me, a voice from the other room penetrated the silence. Ghosts are entirely fictional. They simply do not exist. When your soul parts with this world, you cross over immediately. God doesn't allow souls to slip through the cracks, Father Brown said. His voice was sounding entirely certain. You don't understand, my father interjected. You didn't see what... Hold on, Father Brown cut him off. I'm not invalidating your experiences here, Joshua. What I'm telling you is that it is absolutely not a ghost. Now, while ghosts do not exist, demons are very, very real. My heart leapt. Had I made friends with a demon? Was that even possible? Did that mean that I was bad? Would I go to hell for talking to him? Would God be angry with me for not recognizing him for who he was? My stomach turned, and I imagined all the things that demons were supposed to do to good Christian families. I had heard stories in church, and I didn't understand them entirely, but I knew that they found joy in tormenting those that followed the word of the Lord. What can we do? My mother asked. An exorcism, Father Brown answered. Unfortunately, it isn't as easy as me coming in and reciting the writ, he informed my parents. There was a very strict set of rules. There would have to be an investigation. What? Came a shout from behind me? I screamed. Joey began to cry, and Jack jumped up from his place, using his body to shield as many of us as he could. James brought a demon into our house, Johnny snarled. He glared down at me. Good job, idiot. My features crumbled, and I hadn't been the only one listening. Now everyone would know that I was to blame. Jack would hate me the same way that Jim and Johnny did. Tears streamed down my cheeks, and I curled into myself. I'm sorry, I cried. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. I'm sorry. I had expected angry words from my older brother. I had expected him to turn on me. Instead, he kicked Johnny, making him cry out in pain. Stop being mean to her, Jack snarled. It's not as if any of us knew any better either. I stared up to Jack, warmth spreading through my chest as I realized that I hadn't made him into an enemy as well. Enough, my father roared. Go back to bed. Immediately, I flattened myself on the ground, afraid of what might be done if we didn't listen. Father Brown and Dad went somewhere else, probably to finish the discussion, while my mother picked up Joey and rocked him in the chair. The whole time she glared at Johnny and I, likely blaming the two of us for having woken the baby. I never got back to sleep that night. The next morning, Father Brown offered to do the farm chores for us. My father agreed that the boys shouldn't be there, but he was sure to insist that he would accompany the father. For 2 days we stayed, my father absolutely adamant that no one but he and my mother were allowed to leave the safety of this home. On the 3rd day, everything changed. My mother and father spent every waking hour away from Father Brown's house. Despite our many prying questions, they refused to tell us anything of where they were going. School started Monday, day 6 into our stay with the father. Mom and Dad were gone, and that was something that had just become normal for us. My 2 older brothers and I had gotten dressed and packed lunches, but Father Brown informed us that we wouldn't be attending school that week. We would go the following Monday. It should have been the most exciting news ever, but it felt wrong and made me feel sick. It made the whole situation seem more worse. Not only had David driven us from our home, but he had also put a stop to our daily activities. The boys had stopped helping Dad with the chores. Instead, he and Father Brown did most of it. Mom and I didn't clean the house anymore. Now we weren't even going to school. Everything was wrong, and I hated it. None of us voiced our concerns. Instead, we helped Father Brown with the chores, and we watched television. We cared for Joey, and we played some cards and games, and we kept fighting to a minimum. For days this went on, until Thursday. We woke up to find our parents still home, sitting at the table sipping coffee with the priest as though it were entirely normal. I threw myself at both of them, showering them with love and affection. My mom smiled, and Dad seemed to be happy. I didn't know the reason behind their joy, but I remember feeling as though everything was going to be okay. We were instructed to pack up our things and get into the car. Father Brown gave us each a hug and a handshake, and told us that we were always welcome to come back if we ever needed it. I remember being sad that we were leaving, but also grateful at the same time. I missed my home, and while I didn't plan on ever sleeping in my room on my own again, I did want to go back. When we pulled up to the home, there was a sleek red Geo Metro waiting for us. My siblings and I tossed questioning gazes to it, but Mom and Dad didn't seem concerned at all. Dad parked, got out, and shook hands with a very tall, very wide man. He was dressed in black slacks and a green t-shirt. Red hair clung to his scalp and chin. Over his shoulder, he slung a green backpack with odd white swirly symbols on it. He and my dad spoke for what seemed like forever before my dad motioned for us to get out. "Feels heavy here. I don't think I've ever experienced anything like it." And there was a light accent to go along with the new words that this man spoke. It had a bouncy, rolling tilt to it, reminding me of almost a leprechaun. It took me an embarrassingly long time to realize that he was probably Irish. "Can you do anything about it?" my father asked. His voice trembled with concern, and he was practically wringing his hands in front of himself. I looked behind me to find the rest of my family. They had shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting around the farm as though they had expected David to walk from out of the house or barn at any moment. My mother clutched Joey to her chest despite his protests and flailing arms. She positively refused to put him down, which was only served to piss him off. He used tiny hands to push away from her, shouting something about being a big boy and needing to walk. "Oh, absolutely," the man answered, drawing my attention away from my brothers. I watched the tension melt away from my father's shoulders as he exhaled with sudden relief. "Why don't you go inside and show me and we'll get started," the man asked, before tossing a gaze our way. With a wide, toothy grin, he introduced himself as Brett and extended a hand to me and my brothers. Jack pulled me closer to himself, although I couldn't for the life of me figure out why, and walking up the old wooden porch had my skin crawling. The house looked awful. Once proud and pristine, almost every window was cracked. The paint on the siding had begun to chip, and the plants my mother worked so hard on had withered and died. Dad opened up the door and we stepped inside. Goosebumps rose along my arms, and the air was thick, hot, and heavy. It was hard to breathe, and suddenly I felt as though ants were crawling along my skin. I reached up and, taking Jack's hand in my own, and molded myself against him. It felt so wrong here. Suddenly, I couldn't get the image of David's eyeless face from out of my mind. The man placed his bag on the table and began to pull out a small white pamphlet, as well as a glass bowl and 4 bottles of water. Pathetic little sticky notes labeled them as holy water. I hadn't known it was wrong then, but the older members of the family did. I watched as disbelief washed over my parents' faces. Jack actually laughed, a terrible laugh, a bitter sort of noise that sent a shiver down my spine. I craned my head upward and opened my mouth to ask what was so funny, or perhaps not so funny, but before I could get a single syllable out, static erupted into the silence. I jumped, and Jack pulled me up into his arms. Johnny and Jim just screamed. Making love until the break of dawn. H-Town's knocking boots blared through the radio, and then static again. And I will always love you. I will always love you, my dark static. There it is, the radio whined. A loud, terrible screeching noise, and it had begun to shake. It vibrated down the counter until it slid off, stretching the cord and dangling as it blared the words of various songs. I screamed and buried my face in Jack's shoulder. Brett laughed and said, "It's okay, dear. You don't have to let it bother you." It didn't make any sense to me why Brett wasn't terrified. Why didn't he just jump like Johnny did, or cry like Jack did? I sniffed away the tears and nodded, but try as I might, I couldn't stop my body from trembling. I didn't want to see David again, and I had a feeling that that was exactly what was about to happen. I peeled myself away from Jack's chest, craning my neck so that I could watch Brett, while still managing to stay in my brother's arms. "Throw your little fit while you can," Brett taunted. He pulled the plug from out of the outlet and allowed the radio to just drop to the ground. With a smug sort of smile and a few more reassuring words, he opened a bottle of holy water. Brett's hand hovered over the bowl, and he tilted the bottle. Not a single drop poured from the open mouth before it was knocked out of his hand. Holy water rained down upon the room, splattering the walls and soaking the floor. The bottle rolled, stopping only when it had hit the far wall. It made a slow, glugging noise as the liquid poured out and onto the already destroyed wood flooring. Brett's eyes narrowed. He seemed genuinely confused for several long seconds before he reached for the second bottle. Slam! All 4 bottles on the table were suddenly careening across the room. They hit the windows and they slammed against the cabinets. One cracked the glass of the oven. Brett swallowed hard, eyes with unmistakable fear, and he pulled one final bottle from out of the backpack, and with a shaky hand he unscrewed the top. His eyes were darting around him nervously. I held my breath, waiting for David to send it hurtling across the room, but Brett poured the water out. It sloshed against the glass sides of the bowl, and with bated breath we watched in horror and fascination as he lifted the pamphlet up off the counter and opened to the first page. He spoke in a quivering voice without any conviction, much the way that Johnny spoke to Mom and Dad when he was lying. Brett dipped his fingers into the holy water and allowed it to drip onto the floor. "Most glorious Prince of the heavenly armies, Saint Michael and the Archangel, defend us," and then a small pitter-patter sliced through the silence. My fist tightened against Jack's shirt as I spun around, searching for the source of the noise. Joey's favorite blue ball bounced into the room. We watched in utter silence and awe as it rolled to a stop at my mother's feet. Joey squirmed to get free, shouting about his ball and something about him needing it. My mother held him tightly and moved away from it as though it might even bite her. Jack kicked the ball away from us, and it spun and fled down the hallway. It just rolled back, only to stop at my mother's feet for a second time. My heart was thrumming so quickly I thought it might actually leap from my chest, and my hands were wet with sweat and tears were streaming down my cheeks. Brett licked his lips, and the pamphlet shook his hand. He began the prayer over again, getting no further than when a slow creak interrupted him. With eyes wide, I watched the cupboard just above my father's head open, and he leapt away. Massive hands grabbed the shoulders of both of my brothers and pulled them back away from it. There was no warning, no puff of smoke like in the movies, no ominous music. It just happened. It was like an explosion. Streaks of white and blue and pink and green careened to the ground, and an ear-splitting crash shook me to my very core. Before I could process what had actually happened, the shattered glass of every plate, bowl, dish, and cup my mother owned was splayed at our feet. Every cabinet was opened and emptied. Joey was screaming, and I didn't realize until Jack had placed his hand on my back that I was too. My mother had burst into tears, and my father suggested that we leave. Brett insisted that he could do this and started the prayer over. The burners on the oven turned on, and I could feel the heat from where I was. A bright light sparked to life behind the cracked glass of the oven. At first, I thought that there was some sort of fire inside, but as it grew brighter, I recognized the shape as that of the heating coil inside of it. Bang! The coil exploded and my mother shrieked. She turned to dart out of the front door and something touched my foot. At first, I thought it was Jack, but it was too cold and it was wet. I looked down to find nothing at all, but I felt the invisible fingers tighten around my ankle, and I shrieked. An unseen force jerked me out of my brother's arms, and I hit the ground with all the force of a freight train. While bursts of light exploded into my vision, my eyes rolled aimlessly in my head as I tried to get my bearing again. "What the hell happened?" my dad shouted. "Something pulled her," Jack shouted back. My dad's eyes widened and he leapt forward. My name was on his lips and heavy footfalls exploded just inches away from my feet. And terrifyingly enough, I found myself being dragged. My father gave chase, but he wasn't nearly as fast. "Dad," I shouted. "Jack!" I slid along the hard, wet floor, heading for the stairs. My heart sank, and in that moment I knew I was going to die. There was absolutely no doubt about it. David had me now, and he was going to kill me. I clawed the ground, leaving long claw marks along the soft wood, and I made a desperate grab for anything as I flailed and kicked, trying my best to get away. Heavy sobs tore through my body, and I managed to stop myself as I latched onto the door frame. My father was just feet away from me. My heart was racing. Tears streamed down my face, and I feared the worst, that they wouldn't get to me in time, that David would pull me upstairs and lock the door behind us. "Dad!" I shrieked again. Brett lunged forward, throwing the entirety of the bowl at me, cold water splashing against my skin, soaking me to the bone, and stunning me enough to cause me to let go of the wall. Pain bloomed along my ankle where David had grabbed me, and I wailed in agony. I felt as though my leg had been caught on fire. I thrashed my hands, going to it immediately as my nails dug into the flesh around it. An angry half-growl, half-hiss shook the very foundation of the home. Jack grabbed my arm and pulled me up, and I clung to him, wrapping my arms and legs around him as tightly as I could. "I want to leave," I shouted. "I want to leave." Bang! All at once the doors and windows slammed shut. There is no more menacing and terrifying sound than the simultaneous click of a dozen locks. I buried my face in Jack's shoulder, and I cried. David had no intentions upon letting us leave. "Don't let him take me again, Jack. Don't let him take me," I pleaded through heavy sobs. Jack rubbed my back, and his lips touched my forehead. "You aren't going anywhere," he swore. The faucet turned on. Static filled the air, and my eyes landed on the now unplugged radio that lay just on the side of Brett. "James, James, James, James." The familiar voice oozed from the static. "James," he called my name, very, very wickedly. My father's heavy boot crashed down upon the radio and it shattered, but the static and my name never stopped. Instead, it became distorted and drawn out. Somehow, that had just made it so much worse. Panic was taking over. Joey and I wailed. Johnny had curled up, shaking in the corner as he sobbed. Jim was clinging to my mother, and his face was buried in her shoulder, and even my father was crying. Ding dong, ding dong, ding dong. The doorbell began to ring again and again. The faucet turned itself on and off, and Jack peeled me away from himself, and I clawed at him, grabbing handfuls of his plaid shirt. "No," I shouted desperately. "I want to stay with you." Despite my sobs and protests, he handed me over to my father. "Hold her," he shouted. My dad's muscular arms wrapped around me, and Jack pulled his shirt up and over his head, dashed to one of the largest of the kitchen windows, and wrapped his hand with his shirt. He drew an arm back, and with an ear-splitting crash, the glass shattered around him. With curses on his lips, he was quick to knock out any remaining glass. Click, the windows and the doors unlocked. And then a long creak. The door swung open, and Jim ran toward it. But just as he had stepped through the threshold, my mother pulled him back, and the door slammed shut and locked again. A laugh trickled through the broken radio. "Almost," it teased. I couldn't breathe. Every door in the house had swung open and slammed shut. I could hear them from upstairs, from the basement, from down the hall. We were surrounded by the sound. Jack knocked the screen out and began to wiggle his way out of the window. I heard the crunch of his feet against the gravel, and then he called out, "Get out here!" My mother shoved Joey into Jack's arms first, and then I slid to the outside. I'd never been so happy to see the outdoors in my life. Johnny and Jim were next, and last were my parents and then Brett. Brett tore through the driveway, leapt into his car, and peeled out without ever looking back. Jack whispered a few mumbled curses under his breath as we rushed to our own car. My father sped away, and he swore to us in that moment that we'd stay with the father until we could get a real priest in to do the exorcism to the home. "Do we have to go back?" Jim demanded. "Can't we just sell it and leave?" he asked. There was a long pause. "Who's gonna buy a haunted house?" Johnny asked. Another long pause settled over us, as the reality of the situation had set in. We're screwed, entirely and completely screwed. We had no means of finding a new place to live. We could only invade Father Brown's house for so long. We couldn't sell because who would buy, and we had no money to buy or rent something else. We were stuck. "What if it's not the house that's haunted?" Jim asked, shattering the somber silence that had settled over us, and he stared over at me. I felt like I had been punched in the stomach. Jack hit Jim, but the damage had already been done. What if I was haunted? I couldn't get that thought out of my mind. The rest of the drive to the house passed in a haze. Once there, we practically ran into poor Father Brown's home, never even bothering to knock. Luckily enough, he didn't seem to be upset about it, and together, through sobs, we recounted the terrifying events of that day. Father Brown asked to see my ankle, and the perfect shape of a handprint had been burned into my skin. It wasn't blistering, although it was a bright shade of red and peeling along the sides. He made small noises of discontent and mumbled something about it being a first-degree burn. He turned it this way and that way, and his eyes looked more worried the longer he stared at it. Finally, he looked up at me with a wide, fake smile plastered on his face. It was the same sort of smile Jack had worn the night Johnny had broken his arm. "You'll be okay, James. Why don't we spread some aloe on it and let it heal up?" I didn't argue. I just followed him into the bathroom, where he would let me sit on the bathtub, and I sat down, the cold porcelain biting into my skin, and it made me squirm. Father Brown swung the medicine cabinet open, and the mirror glided past him. I hadn't looked up at it in that very moment. I might have missed it. Father Brown's kind smile and soft eyes stared back at me from the mirror. And then, suddenly, it was nowhere to be seen. Replaced with David's empty eyes and a wicked smile. My hands shook. My breath caught in my throat. My stomach turned, and I jumped to my feet and tore through the hall. Rapid footfalls followed me, and a hand slammed down on my shoulder and tightened, pulling me to a halt. "Dad!" I shrieked. "James," Father Brown said, spinning me around, big blue eyes searching my own green eyes. "James, what's wrong? 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 What's wrong?